Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Sunday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 7th of September. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information from the National Weather Service around Alaska. You can do that easily by going to weather.gov/Alaska or heading to arh.noaa.gov if you like the entire statewide view there. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You can find out information during the day on social media, of course. If you're in the bush and using your smartphone, this is a great way to get that information quickly and without using a whole lot of your cell phone plan. On Twitter, under NWS Alaska, and each Weather Service office, NWS Fairbanks, Juneau, and Anchorage all have accounts. On Facebook, NWS Alaska is a place that you found by now, and it's a great place to share your photos of Alaska with us. We'll like to reshare those too when we get the great ones. And of course on YouTube, if you follow NWS Anchorage there, you can get a daily afternoon map briefing, and NWS Fairbanks is doing the same thing. After this show, you'll get the entire broadcast on our broadcast partners' website, alaskapublic.org, or on their YouTube account. Simply find that by going to AKwx TV. So lots of different ways to get the same information. Your Alaska weather headlines as of tonight. Gales are ongoing for the central Aleutians and offshore in the Arctic waters. Those are expected to continue at least until the mid and late evening hours up north and continuing on into tomorrow for the central Aleutians. The Bering Sea low is really dominating the weather pattern out in the west. We'll look at that here in just a moment. And Arctic air for now is not quite strong enough to punch further southward. So it's going to be a player in the weather maker to come. But it's really going to hang up to the north, so we're not looking for a major cold blast to drop southward, at least for the next couple days there. So that's how we see things. Now we can find that dominant Bering Sea low right here across the southern Bering, and you can see that spiraling in the moisture across the YK and across the eastern side of Russia and the Kamchatka Peninsula. As you'll notice out across eastern Russia, a lot of this moisture is going up and over. Here's a frontal boundary right here. So there is cold air dropping south and east, but it's just not able to punch further south because of the southerly flow being produced by this low pressure system, kind of holding that at bay and really just north of the Bering Strait. Out across the Pacific, several things to keep watch on. There are several waves of tropical moisture that are developing. One of those related to a typhoon. Across areas just south of Japan. You can see that massive moisture here. What happens to this in the next 3 to 5 days? Well, something to keep an eye on as this moisture is kind of sheared apart and wrapped into this much larger low pressure system here. Any moisture that does make it closer to Alaska will likely enhance that rainfall amount that you get if you're under the effects of that moisture passing by your location in Alaska. So we'll be keeping watch of that and seeing how that changes our forecast for you in the coming week or so. Looking around Alaska with the visible satellite picture, you'll see that this is becoming less and less of a useful tool during the entire day now, as of course we're losing daylight fairly rapidly, but still a useful tool and still my favorite. You can see the Gulf of Alaska here, a lot of dry air across southeast, across south central and Prince William Sound, and look at the interior all the way from well, Norton Sound to the upper Yukon Valley and even past Dawson in the Yukon. Things are pretty clear out there, just a beautiful day. Now, there were a few places in south central and southwestern Alaska that were seeing a lot more cloud cover develop across Bristol Bay and across the chain, quite a bit of cloud cover, in fact, under the effects of that low pressure system. But up north, all we're picking up here is snow across the Brooks Range and a lot of clear, dry skies across a good chunk of the Arctic as well. So high pressure's in charge, and where that is, dry air for many across the interior, south central, and certainly across the west coast. Seward Peninsula and Nome had a beautiful day today, and hopefully you had one as well. Now looking at today's weather map, we've got a weak wave of low pressure sitting right across the Kenai, Copper River Basin, and across southeastern Alaska. Just a huge swath of dry air. You can see there, 1,010 millibar low, very weak just south and west of Yakutat, and another wave of low pressure here around Haida Gwaii. The main weather maker for the next several days will be this Bering Sea low at 980 millibars. The question is, how much stronger does it get, or how much lower does that number go, representing the intensity of or the lack of more air right on top of that point there on the map. So as that low pressure system gets stronger, that number would drop. Now, as we look across the northern Bering Sea, up around St. Matthew Island waters, you see the front's trying to work its way northward. Well, the more this system wraps in on itself, the less of a frontal boundary change between air masses we're going to have. So this front's probably going to fall apart fairly quickly. A look up north shows us that there is colder air dropping toward the Chukchi Seacoast, and that high pressure across northwestern Canada at 1,029 millibars really has a firm grasp of across the Yukon and the Arctic coast. And you can see that with those what we call a ridge here, that kind of a bowing out of these contour lines, pressing out toward low pressure. That's a pretty good sign that high pressure is in charge of that area. You'll notice that recedes a little bit as we get into tonight. Now, low pressure across the southern Bering at 988 millibars. Not a whole lot stronger, not a whole lot weaker. Still a fairly decent storm out across the southern Bering. High pressure is still sitting across southeastern Alaska, and it's possible that any clouds that are running over southeast tonight might ring out a few showers. Not substantial rainfall, which is good because the rivers up across northern parts of southeast have been subsiding after a late week surge there, especially around the Taya River and the Chilkoot Trail. Now, the colder air up across the north is still working its way south and east, getting closer and closer to the Brooks Range, and just kind of coming on shore there. You might see some clouds, a little bit of light rain or drizzle, probably fogs more likely. The west coast starting to see showers by late tonight, especially west of King Salmon. And low pressure just north of Adak, again, working in more of a west and northwesterly flow. If you're from Kiska out toward Attu, you'll see more of a northerly flow on that. Otherwise, the western Gulf, including Kodiak, is involved in more of a southerly flow. This warm and wetter air is slowly working in, but remember, it's got to overcome that dry and just very stable air that high pressure has brought all the way in from western Canada. By the time we get into Monday, you'll notice the northern cold air is not moving southward at all. In fact, it's become a stationary boundary. That boundary is something showing that the warm air and the cold air kind of meeting in the middle. No one's really winning the match, as it were. Clouds are building in across Point Barrow, perhaps out toward Wainwright, not quite far east as Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse. And along that boundary, it wouldn't be surprising to see some showers or even rainfall. The low pressure system across the southern Bering hasn't budged much. It's still at 988 millibars. The leading edge of precipitation will be more showery across the western Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill Pass included, into the Susitna Valley. The southern end of the Kenai Peninsula is probably looking at some showers during the day on Monday. Most of that will stay out of the Anchorage area, but it will get fairly close and starting to work into Prince William Sound as well. For southeast, the best chance for showers will be in the morning. Most of this is moving out of the picture as you go through your Monday, so drier weather should be had, and high pressure still in charge of southeast, so enjoy that. And out across the central chain, I'll look for a little bit of a wind at times, probably holding on to gales during the day. And for most of the northern Bering Sea, you have a east to westerly wind, and that should produce pretty dry weather for you as you're getting a taste of what's coming off the continent here. You may see clouds, but the chance of precipitation across the Seward Peninsula should be pretty small. That changes on Tuesday. As the cold air drops a little bit further south toward Kotzebue Sound, the focus for showers will start to fill in there across the western Brooks Range, through the Killabooks, all the way down through the lower Yukon Valley and into southwestern Alaska. Through any of the hills, they probably get just a little bit better chance for some clouds and some showers. The frontal boundary across the eastern Russian coastline is just sitting tight, so it's not going to be a big drop in that cold air into the interior. But you can see the clouds are starting to win over more of Alaska. With that comes a chance for showers, especially south of the Alaska Range through the Kenai Peninsula and Prince William Sound. Southeast starts to see a few more clouds approaching Sitka and points northward toward Gustavus all the way to Yakutat. With that will likely be more showers than anything else. Southern parts of southeast, Ketchikan, Annette, Klawock, you're dealing with a little more sunshine. You're still close enough to high pressure to have a decent Tuesday. Back toward the western Bering, low pressures up to 990 millibars. In this scenario, it doesn't look like the storm's going to get a whole lot stronger, but this is just one idea. There are several models, and some of them really don't agree with this at all. So we will see what happens with time, but keep watching that storm out in the Bering because a little change in its position and certainly a change in its strength will dramatically change the weather for the west coast. So we're keeping watch on that fairly carefully. And don't forget, we have that typhoon out across eastern Asia right now. 4 to 5, even 6 days out from now, the whole weather picture could change if that storm changes its track just a little bit more. Now, across southeastern Alaska, temps are in the upper 50s and lower 60s today. Juneau, probably upper 50s. Klawock, Ketchikan, Annette, also in the lower 60s. Hyder was 57 at 4 o'clock. South Central in the 50s and 60s today. 59 around Talkeetna, 55 for Fairbanks, 53 in Eagle, and Northway saw temperatures in the lower 50s with Prince William Sound generally around 63 in Valdez and Cordova, 54 in Fort Yukon, 48 Arctic Village, 46 for AKwx Pass. Barrow was 49 at 4 o'clock. Kotzebue Sound temperatures were in the lower 50s with Shishmaref at 48. Nome saw 53. Unalakleet was 53 degrees, 57 in Bethel, not across the YK Delta, 52 around Savunga, and temperatures across Bristol Bay were hovering in the mid-50s around King Salmon and Dillingham. A little bit further south toward Pilot Point and Port Hayden, we saw low 50s there. Sandpoint was 57. Unalaska and Dutch Harbor just shy of 60. The Pribilofs in the mid to upper 50s at times. Mid-50s for Adak and Atka, and Shemya was 54. Overnight lows will crash into the mid-20s again for the interior and east. Remember that cool, clear, dry air? Well, it's great with the sunshine during the day, but at night you lose any chance of holding in that heat. So look for a cold night tonight, especially around the Yukon Flats. 33 in Barrow, 36 in Nome tonight. The YK in Bristol Bay in the mid to upper 40s. Most areas just below 50 degrees. You get out toward the Alaska Peninsula, and most areas there will fall into the lower to mid 50s. The Aleutians in the lower 50s, St. Paul 52, southeast mid to upper 40s, south central probably in the mid 40s tonight. Kodiak about 51 with a high of 60 for Monday. Upper 50s and lower 60s for southeast. The interior will likely crest past the 60-degree mark, especially in Fairbanks. Fort Yukon could be a little bit below. For the Arctic coast, look for temps in the low to mid 40s there. You'll be dealing with not necessarily a cold day compared to perhaps what's coming here in a couple days. The YK, mid to upper 40s for most areas, around Nome 55, the Alaska Peninsula just shy of 60, and the chain again in the mid to upper 50s. For the west then, we're looking for IFR conditions, especially under the low in the Bering and across that area with a southerly flow across the western Gulf, and parts of the YK Delta should experience some IFR. Most areas, though, on the leeward side of that southerly flow should see at least a little bit of VFR flying throughout the day. Now, your pass conditions will be changing as a result. Today was a pretty good day across most of the region. AKwx and Adigan Pass are expected to stay VFR during your Monday. We will see some changes over to MVFR for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, and Rainy Pass should see some transition toward MVFR as well. For now, Windy Pass looks to be visual. We expect VFR in Isabel Pass. Mentasta Pass should be just fine at VFR, and we should see Tanita Pass holding at VFR conditions. Portage Pass likely visual flight rule, and Chilkoot and White Pass, of course, with a high pressure in command. VFR should be okay for you as well. Now, freezing levels indicate that cold air is taking over a good part of the middle and upper Yukon Valley. But remember, we've got warm air in charge in the upper atmosphere, so levels aloft anywhere from 8, 10 to 12,000 feet across coastal areas of south central. Around 8,000 feet for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island waters. And here's that cold air trying to drop southward once again. The main thing to focus on here is this is in the morning. By the afternoon, things are dramatically different. Above 10 to about 12,000 feet is where you're going to run into some icing potential there. Some of that might even reach into occasional moderate between St. Lawrence and St. Matthew Island waters around the Pribilofs and then south of Atka, and developing there along that southerly flow coming in. But again, those levels are climbing up higher and higher. And as the moisture leaves in the morning for southern parts of southeast, so too will the icing threat. In the morning, above 12,000 feet, you might run into some light icing potential across the Dixon entrance. Now, high pressure in the upper atmosphere is sitting right over the Gulf of Alaska. Behind that, a trough of low pressure and several waves of that rotating around, slowly trying to move east and southeast. And we also have a departing trough. As that moves across western Canada, it's making way for high pressure to also scoot its way eastward. So we're getting into more of this and maybe a little bit less of the nice weather brought to us by the big blue letter H. Across 9,000 feet, we see high pressure and control of eastern Alaska and the Gulf of Alaska and southeast with more of a northwesterly flow there. On the western side of this ridge is that southerly flow and the moisture working in fairly quickly, anywhere from 15 to 35 knots. The highest winds coming right over the Alaska Peninsula in toward Bristol Bay. Low pressure sitting north of Adak there with winds coming in from the west and northwest through the western chain at 20 to 40 knots. A little bit slower at 3,000 feet, 15 to 20 knots there. South and westerly winds continue over the YK Delta with a southerly flow across the western Alaska range at 20 knots. Pretty slow wind speeds there across the mid and upper Yukon Valley, and a decent westerly flow crossing the Point Barrow region and the Chukchi seacoast with winds around 15 to 25 knots at their strongest. And we still have light winds coming across southeast at 10 knots with, again, a southerly flow coming into the eastern side of Kodiak Island. Turbulence potential then is limited. There might be a small area just west of southeastern Alaska, especially southern southeast, below 4,000 feet for some chop. And across the central and eastern chain below 4,000 feet, and up across the Chukchi seacoast generally below 2,000 feet. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with the Ice Edge and your marine weather here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
The following program is brought to you by the Ocean Alaska Science and Learning Center, a partnership dedicated to understanding and preserving the marine ecosystem connecting Alaska's national parks through research and education. The pristine wilderness of Kenai Fjords National Park is becoming increasingly popular as a destination for kayak campers. As visitor use increases, so does the interaction and potential for conflict between humans and wildlife. Black bears are abundant along the park's coastline, and park managers are interested in preventing negative interactions and protecting both bears and park visitors. A team of researchers is investigating how bears react to human presence in Kenai Fjords National Park. Steve Partridge, biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, is one of the principal investigators in this study.
I think the original focus of it was to try to determine how people's activities in the fjords here affect bear behavior, and especially in places like these meadows that are really important, especially early on for bears. Typically they're losing weight right now as before the berries come out, so anything they can get in the way of green vegetation is good for them. So I think what we wanted to initially do is look at how people moving around in the meadows or approaching on kayaks or powerboats affected these bears in the meadows. And so what we've done is found bears in these meadows, and depending on where the bears were, we might approach them on a powerboat, or we might try to get in on a kayak. But what we're doing is we're with laser rangefinders, we're trying to figure out when the bear notices the person's approach first, and so that would be a distance that we definitely want. And then the next distance we would want, at what point does the bear change its behavior from what it was doing previously, which is generally foraging, to maybe just staring at us now and not eating anymore. And then the probably most important one is, at what point does the bear decide now it wants to leave, it's uncomfortable, people are too close.
Researchers patrolled areas known to be frequented by black bears in early spring. When they sighted a bear, they began a systematic approach, recording the bear's behavior as they drew nearer and nearer.
Bear on the right's watching us too. 205. Yeah.
I'm not sure the exact numbers, but I want to say probably what we'd call the flushing distance, probably averaged right around 100 meters, which I think is fairly consistent.
Since black bears are so abundant in Kenai Fjords, park managers have made efforts to limit human and bear interactions by providing food storage lockers or lines for hanging food on the most popular beaches, and requiring bear-resistant food containers at other locations. Containers can be checked out at the park headquarters in Seward free of charge.
I don't think that this park has had any history of a few, I think, tent destruction cases, but nothing serious where any kind of, injury was involved, I don't believe. So I don't know, it wasn't a safety issue, I think. It's maybe just trying to look and see if we could, as this part of the bay becomes more popular, try to get in ahead of the curve and putting together some really good guidelines for kayakers to try to minimize any disturbance that people may have in these meadows.
The Nuka Bay region, where Partridge's team was working, is the more seldom visited part of Kenai Fjords National Park. It also contains more extensive meadow habitat than the more steep-sided fjords elsewhere in the park.
And these places provide some of the only opportunities they have, or the earliest opportunities they have, to get grass. And a lot of these places that are snow-free, at least back to a little ways. So there's always a little vegetation on the periphery that they can get. So it's definitely important in early season, and just good forage for them, I think. So.
Another part of the study involved monitoring the most productive meadows with time-lapse video cameras for several days with no humans present, then establishing a camp in the meadow to see if the bear's foraging behavior was affected. This data has not been fully analyzed yet. In general, though, Partridge was surprised at how oblivious some bears can be to human presence.
Or there's a misconception about how how much bears are paying attention to their surroundings. I think a lot of people think they're really tuned into everything and they can, you know, they see you at a mile or smell you at a mile. But I think a lot of times, since they're not typically worried about predators, they kind of, you know, get in their own little world like the absent-minded professor. And boy, I've surprised a lot of bears, you know, and as probably a lot of other people have, without trying it at all. So that was surprising. That I think it's, you know, I think sometimes they're not paying as much attention as you think they should be. You know, you learn out here for sure how difficult it is to try to tease these things out, and I think probably, if nothing else, I think we'll get great data on the approaches. I think we can provide Kenai Fjords with some good information there, and I think a lot of people, if you just tell them that, you know, hey, here's these meadows and there's going to be a lot of bears in there and it's a good area for them to feed, that they'll probably avoid those areas because they don't want to disturb the animals, and a lot of times they just need the information. And so hopefully we'll be able to provide a lot of good basic information on how these bears are using these meadows.
In the end, park managers hope to use the information that Partridge and his co-investigators are gathering to minimize the potential for negative or harmful interactions between bears and park visitors, while maximizing the opportunities for bears to thrive and people to enjoy the wilderness of Kenai Fjords National Park.
I think, you know, we still have a really good chance up here to preserve wild populations of bears, and there's a lot of areas I think that there's really good conservation efforts. So for a bear biologist, this is a dream come true, you know. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff to do up here. So.
Always pays to be bear aware in Alaska, of course. Here's a look at today's sea ice edge, and well north of the coastline, around 100 nautical miles give or take, from Kaktovik and Point Barrow, you can see the limits of the sea ice as analyzed by our sea ice experts there. Most of that is fairly thin on the edge, and you see quite a bit of melting going on north of Wainwright and north of Point Barrow. Anytime you want to check on the latest ice conditions there, you can do so by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php, and you can download the shapefiles you need to make a map similar to this, whether it's just curiosity's sake or you're actually looking to see how things are going along the coast. We're probably a couple weeks away from the sea ice minimum for the year before we start seeing that ice advance once again for the season. Here's a look at the marine forecast now for southeast. Winds will stay pretty light, especially along the coast. General northwesterly flow at 5 to 10 knots, if that. 5-foot seas there along the coast, 3, maybe even 2-foot seas there on the inner waterways. Generally a northerly flow about 10 to 15 knots on Tuesday. You see a little bit of a change in the wind speed here in the inner waterways. Still looking at light winds along the coast, but we start to pick up more of a southeasterly flow heading up toward Yakutat. 5 to 6-foot seas there. 5-foot seas continue south of Sitka toward the Dixon entrance, and a northeasterly flow across Stevens Passage and Frederick Sound. As we get into Monday for South Central, look for a light and variable flow inside of Prince William Sound. Northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet, a little bit of a stronger flow crossing over the Barrens at 15 to 20 knots. Winds still pretty light around Kodiak Island, a 6-foot sea on the east side, 4-foot seas on the inside of Shelikof Strait. By Tuesday, winds are picking up outside of Prince William Sound at 25 knots with 7-foot seas. Easterlies inside the Sound up to 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Northeasterlies continue for Cook Inlet, and a light and variable flow inside of Shelikof Strait with a 2-foot sea expected for Tuesday. Around the Alaska Peninsula, south and westerly winds continue, 15 to 25 knots on the north side and 15 to 20 knots on the Pacific side with 9 to 11-foot seas. By Tuesday, we expect more of a southerly flow to develop. We'll still hold on to southeasterlies inside of Bristol Bay with a 4-foot sea, 6-foot seas north of Cold Bay, and on the Pacific side, 7 to 9-foot seas develop there with 15 to 25 knots coming in from the south. Across the chain, a south and southwesterly flow for the central and eastern islands, 35 knots north of Unalaska with a 10-foot sea, 13 to even 16-foot seas as you head south into the Pacific with 25 to 30 knots to the east, 35 knots south of Adak and Atka, and more of a west and northwesterly flow for the west and central chain. That changes a little bit, and winds diminish as we get into Tuesday in those areas. 6-foot seas are expected with a west and southwesterly shift as low pressure kind of meanders a little bit more across the southern Bering. We'll keep a southerly flow north of Unalaska and southwesterlies on the Pacific side with 10 to 11-foot seas as we get into Tuesday. Once again, gales are ongoing now for the central and eastern chain tonight. Monday's forecast for the west shows easterlies coming out of Norton Sound at 30 knots, a south and easterly flow coming over the YK Delta and coastline, 7 to 8 foot seas. There's southerlies over the Pribilofs with a 30-knot wind at 11 foot seas. By Tuesday, that diminishes somewhat down to 20 knots with a 9-foot sea. Easterlies still possible over the St. Matthew Islands with southeasterly winds coming up the YK coastline. Over the Kuskokwim Bay area, 25-knot winds are expected with a 7-foot sea for Tuesday. Now for the Arctic coast, you'll notice the wind shifting around a little bit. Remember that colder air is trying to make its way southward and gets pretty close to the coast by tomorrow. So 15 to 20 knots there, just off of Point Lay and Point Hope. Easterlies out of Kotzebue Sound and westerlies east of Barrow toward Kaktovik at 15 to even 20 knots there, right around the point. By Tuesday, here comes the cold air, and it's going to linger right along the coastline with north and easterly winds the strongest from Barrow all the way down the Chukchi Sea coast at 30 knots, 6 to 8 foot seas there, and 2 to 3 foot seas across the Beaufort Sea coast with winds as high as 15 to 25 knots by Tuesday. Recapping tonight's weather, there is cold air to the north and west. It's having trouble breaking off and moving south and east fairly quickly thanks to low pressure sitting across the southern Bering at 988 millibars. It's moving a lot of air northward across the west coast, and that means more of a southerly flow there, and showers are developing from west to east as that drier air begins to erode and becomes a little bit wetter on that southerly wind. High pressure sitting way out across western Canada and across the Gulf of Alaska. That may allow a few showers to transit southeastern Alaska. By tomorrow morning, they'll be leaving fairly quickly across the southern parts of the inner waterways and coastal areas of southeast. The clouds are building into the interior, but you should have a mainly dry day for most areas there, especially north of the Yukon. From McGrath and points south and west, including the western Alaska Range, visibility will be dropping slowly in some of the passes there. The wind shouldn't be too terribly strong, but rain will be advancing, especially from King Salmon eastward and across the chain. Look for stronger winds to continue into Tuesday. That's your Alaska weather. Thanks for watching. See you again tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.